Welcome to Pick Me Up, I'm Scared, the podcast.
I am your host, Madeline, and Kenna today is out sick with strep throat. So unfortunately, you just have another solo episode with me. I think this will be the first one I've done on my own since I did the fast fashion episode. And I gotta say, I'm a little scared. It's a lot of pressure. So I wanted to do a topic that was kind of near and dear to my heart, so at least I felt confident speaking about it all on my lonesome today. If you are looking for more Madeline and Kenna content together, though, please be sure to stop by our Patreon. It's patreon.com/pickmeupimscared. You can find 26 bonus episodes there, and it's just $2 a month, and we add 2 more episodes every month. Kenna's been working really hard on being active on our Patreon lately, so I wanted to be sure to give a shout out to all of her hard work. So today, though, here on the Reggie Eppies, not the Bony Eppies as we call them over there on our Patreon, I think I have a pretty good episode for you. So grab a beverage, grab a loved one, grab whatever you need to get through the day, and strap on in for episode number 70. So I've always been active on the internet. In the early days of dial-up, I spent my time on message boards or the Craigslist rideshare section. And if you listen to our episode about social media, you probably heard me talk about all about this. Like, I would meet up with strangers from nearby towns like Bakersfield or Visalia and take these mini road trips down to Los Angeles to see our favorite bands play. And I just did this because the more people you could fit in a car, the cheaper the gas was. And we would sometimes meet up in places like McDonald's parking lots and size each other up, looking each other up and down, just hoping that the other person wouldn't rob us or, worse, maybe make us listen to really bad music for 3 hours straight while we drove. So for broke, sketchy weirdos, the internet was always a place for us to find real world community, not just online. And as technology became more advanced, I found myself joining a lot of early subculture-based social media sites like Makeout Club and Lipstick Party and Mad Red Hair, all of which we also talked about in our episode on social media. I was on MySpace, I had a Zanga online diary, and as time progressed, I even got a fashion blog, and I would chronicle my daily outfits, then eventually an Instagram, and I would post selfies and memes, and then, when TikTok became the it platform, I joined that too, and that's where I amassed a little bit of a following. So, on TikTok, I tell strangers a story about my life, right? Everything from my thoughts about the cost effectiveness of my college education to how to cope with grief and loss. I tell stories about my childhood with my dad and working horrible minimum wage jobs. I give tips and tricks for getting hired quickly at temp agencies if you're in between gigs, or how to pawn things around your house if you're short on rent. And the audience that I amassed there on TikTok just seems to be a lot of people like me, Gen Z, millennials, who are struggling to piece together a good life in the middle of what feels like a dumpster fire of capitalism and labor exploitation. So many of us are broke and tired. And I kind of realized that my TikTok account, became a place where we could all commiserate about our struggles. And that makes sense because the internet's always been a place where people could go to feel a little less alone. No matter who you are, no matter where you come from, if you are online long enough, you are bound to find somebody you can relate to. And today I feel like the algorithms know us better than we know ourselves, and they push us into other like-minded people at these lightning fast speeds. And sometimes it creates feedback loops and insular communities that lull us into a sense of comfort and safety, while also making it maybe increasingly harder to find people who don't share our opinions 100% of the time. But also sometimes the echo chamber's just nice, So whatever, the algorithm pushes me into other broken, struggling people who hated capitalism almost as much as I do, and people who are frustrated with feeling helpless and hopeless all at the same time. And on my small corner of the internet, it feels like just a given that if you're here and you're watching my videos, you also loathe the contemporary political and economic system that controls our day-to-day lives just as much as I do. And if sometimes people end up on my videos and they don't see eye to eye, it just feels like maybe an internet troll accidentally stumbled onto what we call the wrong side of the algorithm. One day, though, I got this comment from a stranger that was neither of these two things. It wasn't just a lost troll from the wrong side of the internet tracks, and it wasn't a like-minded person from the typical parasocial algorithmic feedback loop that I'm accustomed to. This commenter seemed to fall somewhere in the middle. A person consuming the stories about my life, not as a microcosm for the world at large, but just as a way to better understand me as a person and my individual human experience. And it was weirdly like a very humanizing thing to see on the internet, and it made me kind of pause. And to this day, this is still my favorite comment I think I've ever received online on any platform the whole time I've been there. It just said, "I don't hate capitalism, but the more I learn about your life, the more I understand why you do." And it was surprising, right? It was surprising to see somebody on the internet disagree with you, but respect your perspective and experiences enough to keep tuning into what you have to say. That's just like not how we think of the internet, right? The internet is supposed to be a place where you go to drive people to tears because you're upset that they enjoyed a cup of coffee in the morning in the garden with their partner, right? Like that's a thing that we all just saw happen on Twitter. I recently had a bunch of videos go positively wacky because of how me and my boyfriend split our grocery costs up. So no, you don't really expect that people on the internet are going to be like, "Hey, I don't have the same perspective as you, but I respect your perspective and I'm interested in learning more about it." And the other thing that was a little surprising is that the way it was worded made me feel more seen and understood than maybe I'd ever felt in my entire life, which is not exactly something you would expect from a random comment that you read on the internet. You know, obviously, yeah, my ideological qualms with capitalism are caused by the experiences I've had in my life up to this point. But it wasn't until I read that comment that I realized just how direct the cause and effect actually was. And now, when I think about my life, when I think about how my life has affected my views on capitalism, to me, it comes down to four main things that I've experienced. Number one is my childhood with my family and our relationships with money. Number two is my experience in the labor force, working a bunch of really shitty, weird jobs. Number three is the death of my partner, who committed suicide after running into money issues. And number four is the Great Recession. Like, these are all the major milestones in my life. And the more I think about them, the more I realize how truly inevitable it was that my frustrations would grow to become so pointedly directed at capitalism itself. Like, even proponents of capitalism could see from these four significant experiences in my life the ways in which the system had failed me. From like being broke as a child with struggling parents, to the series of dead-end jobs that would often compromise my safety just for the sake of making billionaires even richer, to obviously the horrific trauma of losing someone you love very suddenly, and yeah, to one of the two major catastrophic economic collapses I'd experienced in my adult years, right? So today we're going to talk about one of those four things. One of the two major catastrophic economic collapses that most millennials have experienced in their life, and it is the Great Recession. So if Kenna was here today, I would ask Kenna, what do you know about the Great Recession? And then Kenna would probably tell me all about The Big Short, I think, because that's a movie that she recommended I watch. And I did watch it, and it was about largely the circumstances that led to the Great Recession. And it's really, really interesting because when you watch that movie, you see how much people in banking and people in like asset management really view all of society as a casino where they can gamble to try to make themselves even richer. But you know, my understanding of the Great Recession wasn't from that insider kind of pitch, right? I understood the Great Recession as somebody experiencing it. And one of the most interesting things to me is the way that my own life has mirrored the Great Recession. Like, I was a child when the circumstances that led to it started to fall into place. I was born in an era where we were seeing the beginning of peak Reaganomics happen, the 80s. By the time the 90s and early 2000s came about, we were seeing prime conditions for people in banking institutions to just run amok, doing anything they wanted to try to turn a quick buck. And by the time I graduated from college in 2009, I graduated smack dab into this huge recession that would permanently affect the way I related to the world forever. But to start to understand the Great Recession from the other side, what was actually happening in the banking area and the markets at the time, we have to go back to the years 1995 through 2006. So in 1995, I was 9 years old. And there was something forming in the United States called a bubble in the housing market. And this bubble, it just meant that something was artificially overvalued, meaning it was raising in price way too fast and it was super unstable. And for the housing market in the United States, this was happening with the price of housing and also with the increasing ease with which anyone could get a loan to buy a house. So what this meant is you had a lot of houses that were getting more and more expensive, and you had a lot of broke people who now all of a sudden had these newfangled ways to buy those super expensive houses. And together, these two things meant that there was a pretty good chance that in the future, broke people wouldn't be able to afford the houses they were buying with these flexible, easy loans because the houses were way overvalued and they were way more expensive than they should have been. But, broke people want to do what's best for their financial future. I know a lot of conservative people like to tell us that poor people are poor because they don't know what to do with their money. But on the flip side, poor people usually have pretty good instincts about what to do with their money. They just don't have enough money. So, if you see something that's an appreciating asset like a house, and you know that you are paying money every month out to a landlord anyway, and you are a low income person, yeah, it's pretty reasonable that you're going to do anything in your power to try to buy your own home. And I say that as somebody who was broke and did exactly this. When I bought my home 3 years ago, in 2019, 4 years ago almost, I was in what HUD categorized as the very low income range in Los Angeles based on my income. And I did everything in my power to try to buy a house because I thought that it would be a good financial investment for my future. And for me, it has been. But for a lot of people who were doing this in the 90s and early 2000s, they didn't understand what was happening at large in the market in the United States when they were buying these homes. So, the main issue here, obviously, is that housing has always been commodified in a system of capitalism. But in the 90s and early 2000s, housing was experiencing this ultra commodification. And it's almost like housing should not be a commodity at all, right? It's like everyone should just get a house for free, especially in a country that guarantees us our right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We know that unhoused people are 350% more likely to die prematurely than housed people. Houses are integral to having your right to life. We know that, and that's why the UN's human rights doctrine says outright housing is a human right and has been viewed too much like a commodity instead. And this is a problem. And if you're wondering what this has to do specifically with the United States from 1995 to 2006, it's important to remember that the United States voted in favor of this declaration, the UN Declaration about Human Rights. We were actually one of the first 48 countries involved in supporting this. And our government has officially agreed on paper that, yes, it recognizes that housing is a human right. But in the United States today, we still don't have access to housing as a human right, which is why we have over 500,000 unhoused people here today. And much like the UN critique, we instead treat it as a commodity that rapidly harms people. So this is all important because to understand the Great Recession, we have to get into the actual American mindset on housing. Despite telling the world that we agree that it's a human right to have shelter, our hyper-capitalistic structure has instead chosen to uphold the rapid commodification of housing and make shelter into something that's a tool the rich can use to get even richer with. And this is what was happening while the housing bubble was forming in the mid-90s. And the thing about bubbles, which we all know, is that they tend to burst. But back in 1995, nobody was walking around talking about how we were in the middle of a housing bubble, right? Instead, everyone was like, hey, buying a house is a smart move. It's going to go up in value and we'll hopefully make some money. This is a sure investment. And banks at the time pretty much agreed. The banks were like, look, housings are always going to go up in price. That means it's going to go up in value. And the way it works when you buy a house, right, is that unless you buy it outright just in cash, like you have hundreds of thousands of dollars of cash laying around, you buy it from a bank using a loan called a mortgage, which means technically the house is owned by the bank until you pay it off. They give you this thing called a grant deed, which means you get to act as the legal owner while paying the mortgage more or less. But if you ever stop paying the mortgage, the bank can come and repossess your house and take it away from you as collateral for your unpaid loan. And that is called a foreclosure. And then the bank will sell the house to someone else to recoup its losses on the loan. So if the bank knows that it has a buyer for the house, if you default on your mortgage and they repossess it, then they know from a bank's perspective, right, that the mortgage is a safe product for them to use. And they start to realize that, hey, it doesn't really matter if we give loans to low-income people who might not be able to repay them, because we'll still be able to recoup the house and sell it at a reasonable rate, and probably realistically even at a profit, since the value of houses keep rising. And this makes sense as long as everyone's houses don't get foreclosed on at the same time, and as long as the price of houses doesn't tank. And yes, that is ominous foreshadowing. But this is the mid-90s, remember? So banks start thinking, hey, what if we could be making a lot more money off of these mortgages we're giving people if we just got a little looser with the rules? And they start to introduce these new types of mortgages for what they call subprime borrowers. So to get this, we have to talk about what exactly a subprime borrower is. So a subprime borrower in general is just someone who maybe has a bad credit score or low income or kind of a lot of debt, or maybe even just not that much money saved for the down payment to buy the house. And subprime borrowers are affected, like every borrower, by this thing called interest rates. That is how much on top of the loan price the bank is charging people for the loan. This is how the bank makes money off of lending. And interest rates for things like loans are set by the Federal Reserve, which was created by the US Congress. And that's because they figured out during the Great Depression that actually just letting the free market be truly free kind of resulted in mass economic destruction. So they implemented what was then called a heterodox economic theory in an effort to save capitalism, Keynesian economics, which involved the government controlling the marketplace by doing things like regulating interest rates at a federal level to help prevent runaway inflation or deflation. So the interest rate that an average American might get for a home loan, right, the mortgage, is based off of this thing called the prime interest rate, which is set by the Fed. And the prime interest rate is the basis on which all other interest rates are generated. Someone who is in a relatively healthy financial position with a prime credit score, which is usually 660 or higher, they might qualify for a loan with that prime interest rate, or the best interest rate that the bank can give you. In general, yeah, the higher your credit score, the better your interest rate will be because of this. Which is also really interesting because it means that poor people will end up paying more for the same product than a rich person usually, because someone with more access to money tends not to have trouble paying their bills on time and tends to have a better credit score, which means that their interest rates are lower versus somebody maybe who comes from a poorer background. They might have trouble staying on top of their bill payments. They may be late on a few payments or miss a payment, and their credit score will be negatively affected by this. And once their credit score goes down far enough, that means that they'll be hit with higher interest rates. So that means if a rich person and a poor person have, a high credit score and a low credit score, relatively speaking, and both go take out a $10,000 loan, that $10,000 loan is going to cost more money for the person with a worse credit score. So this is why your credit score affects how much you're going to pay for things. So yeah, prior to the mid to late 1990s and early 2000s, someone with a credit score that was below what we call that prime indicator, they would have found it very difficult to get a loan to buy a home because they would have been considered subprime. But these new lending products the banks started coming out with, they suddenly started targeting subprime borrowers. And that's why the loans that they were giving them were called subprime loans, which is probably a term you've heard before, even if you don't know much about the housing market or the Great Recession. And this trend of subprime lending picked up steam in the late 1990s and moved into the early 2000s. And subprime borrowers who had most likely struggled financially their whole lives were being told, hey, buying a house, always a good investment. And whatever loan the bank offers you, this is probably the only way you can get your hands on that investment. Which also happens to come with a little fairy tale to tug at the heartstrings, right? You get your perfect front yard and your perfect little fence and your minivan in the driveway for your 2.5 kids. It's the American dream. And it's great when poor people can afford to own their own homes instead of paying a landlord every month, right? But these subprime loans created a system where it got really hard for poor people to keep up with their mortgage payments once they bought the house. And this happened for a few reasons. One being those higher interest rates that target people with worse credit scores. But the other happened to be this thing called an adjustable rate mortgage. So an adjustable rate mortgage means that when you buy a house, you get it based on the interest rates the Fed sets, right? But on an adjustable rate mortgage, over time, the interest rate will change as the Fed changes interest rates in general, which they do multiple times per year. So unlike a fixed rate mortgage, which locks you in at whatever interest rate is on the line when you buy, then sets your housing prices in stone for the length of the loan, the adjustable rate mortgage means that your monthly housing payment can change over the lifetime of the loan. Now, in theory, adjustable rate mortgages save people money over time. Like whenever they've done studies averaging out the interest rates and how much people pay, when they sign up, blah, blah, blah. They're like, yeah, this will save you money in the long run. But when you're on the broke side and cash flow is an issue because you don't have a lot of financial reserves set aside in like your savings, sudden fluctuations in your housing costs can mean disaster financially, especially if you were a subprime borrower who already got a pretty high interest rate to begin with. Remember that the Fed sets the interest rates for the prime borrowers, and then banks are allowed to charge more for people whose credit scores are lower. Now, my dad and stepmom bought a house in the 90s while all of this was happening. And it did, yes, get foreclosed on along with the same exact timeline. When my father and stepmother moved into their first home in 1995, the federal interest rate for an adjustable rate mortgage was around 5.7%. By the time the house was foreclosed on in the year 2000, that number had shot up to 7.3%. It's a small percentage of difference, but when you're talking about a purchase that's in the hundreds of thousands of dollars range, this can mean a pretty big increase in your monthly housing costs if your interest rate is going to change along with the new interest rate set by the Fed. So on a house that cost $140,000, like my father's did, the difference in minimum monthly payments would have gone from $813 per month to $960 per month. And that's even at the prime rate with that adjustable rate mortgage. And if you bought a house in 2003 when interest rates were 3.52% for an adjustable rate mortgage, by 2006 you would really be struggling because the interest rate shot up to 5.79%. Like if you bought the median priced house in 2003 in the United States, it'd be a little under $190,000. And your mortgage payment then would be around $852. But by 2006, your mortgage payment could suddenly change and be more like $1,100, like over $250 more that you would suddenly be expected to pay on your house each month. And it might not sound like a lot, but remember that the federal minimum wage back then was $6.75 per hour, and it is not much better now, right? But still, it was even lower then. And that means that if you were broke, like many subprime borrowers were, and working a minimum wage job, for example, it would add an extra 38 hours of work you would need to do per month to make up the difference of that new $250 increase in your housing costs. So you really start to see how these adjustable rate mortgages could mean scary, huge changes and fluctuations in housing prices, especially for people who are subprime borrowers who had struggled with money in the past. So while predatory lending was kind of taking off in the housing market based around these subprime borrowers being seen as an opportunity, another new mortgage-based innovation was happening at the bank level too. People's mortgages were being pooled together into these big groups, and these formed the basis for securities to be sold to investors who received money based on borrowers' monthly mortgage payments. And these were called mortgage-backed securities, and they had started picking up steam back in the 1970s. It is admittedly a little bit confusing, but you don't necessarily need a comprehensive understanding of mortgage-backed securities to see how this ended up causing even more trouble in the housing market in the 90s. The two main government-sponsored mortgage lending institutions, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they guaranteed these securities, meaning if borrowers defaulted on their mortgage or stopped paying, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac would ensure that the investors didn't lose money. Originally, these mortgage-backed securities only applied to those traditional prime borrower loans, which were pretty safe bets based on the credit histories of the borrowers from the bank's perspective. By the mid-1990s, though, these mortgage-backed securities started to increase to include the riskier subprime loans on the private market, which had targeted people who were financially struggling. And in the end, private Wall Street investors, in effect, financed everyday people's home purchases by acquiring mortgage-backed securities from the banks that originated those risky predatory loans. And if this sounds messy, it's because it is, and it gets a whole lot messier. Soon, these subprime mortgages were also being grouped together into something called a collateralized debt obligation, or CDO. From there, the cash coming in from these mortgages was allocated to different investors in different ways based on their risk tolerance. The private banks that developed these CDOs were able to convince credit rating agencies to assign high ratings to investors in the highest risk class. From there, private financial institutions also sold insurance on those mortgages to CDO investors in case the mortgages went into default, and the borrowers, everyday people like my family, for example, could not pay. So what this means is all of these special products that are being sold to investors, they have like a lot of insurance from the banking end, meaning they're pretty safe investments, and lots of people like them because they look attractive. And because lots of people liked those products, it made it even more attractive for banks to take on those subprime loans since they had relatively little to lose. So banks were originating sketchy loans, sure, but they weren't really carrying much of the risk associated with them. Investors were. And as banks became incentivized to provide more subprime loans, the demand for housing went up because more people found themselves suddenly eligible to purchase. And this caused the value of homes to inflate even more within that bubble. So in short, the commodification of housing, something that's so intrinsically linked to human survival that it's been declared a human right by the UN in a document that the United States signed, led to investors gambling with its profitability in increasingly unstable ways that relied upon preying on vulnerable, low-income, and struggling families. In short, banks used broke people as pawns, then investors gambled on broke people's homes, all with the hopes of making financially stable companies and rich people big amounts of profit. Now, 7 years after my dad's house gets foreclosed on by the bank, I am in college. The year 2007 is when all of this really starts to come to a head. And the government is like, wait a minute, this whole subprime mortgage and mortgage-backed security and CDO thing, this might be a problem. And one of those two government-sponsored main mortgage lending institutions, Freddie Mac, announces that they're no longer going to be purchasing these risky subprime mortgages and mortgage-backed securities. So by April of 2007, this house of cards that was subprime lending starts to kind of topple in a major way. This company called New Century Financial, which specialized in subprime mortgages, they had annual loans of $60 billion with a B dollars in 2006. They declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy. And while this is happening, those interest rates that the Fed sets, they start to climb. So the Fed is raising interest rates, and that means that now all of a sudden people who bought houses from 2002 to 2005, for example, when interest rates were lower, started struggling to keep up with those new higher payments. And they start defaulting on their loans. They're like, look, I can't afford this new monthly house payment. It's way higher than it was, and I'm not financially prepared for it. And then those houses start to get foreclosed on in a major way. Now, remember, subprime lenders and investors had been profiting off of these average broke home buyers for years. And now they were taking their houses away too. Because remember, it wasn't technically the borrower's house. The house still technically belonged to the bank who gave them the loan. But while all of this is happening, the US stock market is booming. It hits an all-time high back then, October 2007. Still, as the year 2007 came to a close, the National Bureau of Economic Research was like, hey, we've actually had 2 straight quarters of economic decline, and that means we're announcing that the United States is officially in a recession, which just goes to show you that the stock market success is not an indicator of the financial health of the country. So by the end of 2007, the Great Recession was officially underway, and the U.S. unemployment rate stood at 5%, up 0.6% from the year before. Home foreclosures, though, were up to 2.2 million for the year, which was a 79% increase from 2006, which is pretty major. So, next year, 2008, in February, the president at the time was George W. Bush, and he signs the Economic Stimulus Act of 2008. We've got a recession going on. It's looking a little scary. And this legislation is meant to stimulate the economy by providing tax breaks to businesses mostly, and also providing American people, with income tax rebates so they get a little bit more spending money. Whenever anybody in the government says that they're going to help stimulate the economy, they never just give poor people money, which is the thing that actually probably would do the best to help stimulate the economy. But no. They're like, no, our goal is to give American people a little extra money in their pockets, and these are really specific ways. And they have to do this because consumer spending is the backbone of the U.S. economy. Frankly, our economy in a system of capitalism only works as long as people are buying things, and lots of things, at an increased rate, whether they need them or not. However, out of the households that received this rebate, only 20% reported that they would actually spend it buying frivolous consumer goods. Because remember, people are pretty smart, and when they know they're in a recession, they're going to want to be more prudent with their spending. Instead, 32% of people who received it just said that they saved it, and 48% used it to just pay down debt on purchases they had already made. So studies showed that the tax rebates were too little too late for struggling families who had already been forced to spend beyond their means due to slumping wages and predatory loans that they were just trying to catch up on. What consumer spending did happen was limited and significantly smaller than in previous years. So as consumers at the time, we were introduced to ideas like the recessionista, someone who was able to stay fashionable and current while spending as little money as possible. Consumer spending just became smaller and more controlled. Things like clothing swaps got super popular, so you could trade consumer luxury goods like apparel with your friends without needing to break the bank to get something new. Basically, people were not stimulating the economy, they were busy trying to survive. So the backbone of the economy, consumer spending, it started to kind of seize up. And that now meant that regular companies outside of the housing sector and finance sector and bank sector, they all started to feel the heat of the recession because they were having lower sales and overall lower revenue as a result. The next month, in March of 2008, an 85-year-old brokerage firm called Bear Stearns collapsed, and it ended up getting purchased by JP Morgan Chase at a heavily discounted price of just $2 per share, which was a huge decrease from the $30 per share that the company had been valued at just days before the sale. And remember, when people talk about shares, they're talking about shares of stock, because shares of stock, that's ownership stake in a company. So this was a shocking blow right to global financial confidence, both at the consumer level and at the institutional level. Like, average people didn't really know what Bear Stearns was, but they knew that everyone was pretty freaked out that it collapsed, and that can't be something good. Per capita consumer spending, which is, the amount of money the average person in the United States was spending per year just on things, it was already in decline in 2008 compared to 2007. This was the first annual drop in decades. In July of 2008, IndyMac, a private mortgage lender and parent company to Countrywide Financial, collapsed, resulting in 4,000 people losing their jobs. And this is actually pretty major because this is the 7th largest mortgage originator in the United States. So by July, unemployment was up to 5.8%, and nearly 9 million Americans were unemployed. Companies started to go out of business from low sales and low revenue, like everywhere you looked. And on top of that, there were a lot of foreclosures. In 2006, prior to the Great Recession, there had been around 700,000 foreclosures in the United States. In 2008, the number was 2.3 million, over 3 times as high. And by September of 2008, bankruptcies were also picking up steam. Washington Mutual, a company with over $300 billion in assets, filed bankruptcy. And that was massive. It made it the largest bank failure in U.S. history. So the U.S. government steps in. $188 billion in deposits get seized by the U.S. government's Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC. The people who ensure that when you put money in the bank, you're definitely going to get it back. And they sold the company's assets and liabilities to JP Morgan Chase for just $1.9 billion. The following day, the U.S. Treasury took over management of Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, who together had guaranteed 80% of U.S. home mortgages, 30% of which were something called underwater, meaning the house was valued at less than the total mortgage loan amount of this time it was assessed, which basically meant if you were to sell your house, you wouldn't even make enough money to pay off your loan. 1 week later, the largest bankruptcy case in the United States history hit. Lehman Brothers brokerage firm. They had $619 billion in debt. The following day, the U.S. government announced plans to bail out the insurance company AIG, citing the idea that it was too big to fail, a term later coined to explain this phenomenon of the U.S. government stepping in to try to help all of these companies. And this meant basically that the U.S. government was like, we think the closure of this company would have resulted in catastrophic widespread damage in the United States. So the U.S. government paid $85 billion for 80% of the company's assets. In the too big to fail era, we saw firsthand how the biggest winners of capitalism seldom operate within the free market they seem to laud so loudly. Right, like in a true free market, these companies would collapse completely. But it's worth noting that government backing and sponsorship helped create many of the successes of these mega corporations too, allowing them to profit in a major way and even monopolize certain industries in the process. The Great Recession showed us that the free market of capitalism was never truly free for the powerful and wealthy on top. They played by a different set of rules than the small businesses and the individual workers ever did. In short, the government had their back and regular people were left to fend for themselves. So as the government makes all these deals with these massive businesses that are struggling but deemed too big to fail, meanwhile, unemployment climbs to 6.1%. And in early October, the stock market takes its largest ever weekly loss. Now, the reason why this matters is that the US stock market is the foundation for retirement planning in the United States. So what this means is that average Americans started to see their retirement accounts go down in value very quickly. And understandably, they panicked. They were afraid. And while they were panicking, financial pundits on television started to realize they could make a lot of money from amping the panic. So they start to get really, really clickbaity for views. And they just kind of encourage the panicking and stoke the flames. They're like, what if you freaked out about this too? Like on October 6th, for example, one of these guys, Jim Cramer, tells people watching the Today Show to pull all of their money from stocks if they thought they would need cash for anything in the next 5 years. So the thing about the stock market, right, is that it goes up and down in value all the time. You only earn or lose money when it comes time to sell. And there's that old joke about it, right? Like, do you have any advice for investing? And the answer is always buy low, sell high. And it's a joke because people think it's this really complicated process and there are a lot of moving parts. But honestly, the concept of making money from the stock market really is that simple. You buy a stock for $5 and you sell it when it gets to 10, for example. And it's pretty consistent. Like the S&P, which is like an aggregate of lots of stocks on the market, goes up on average 10% per year every year over 100 years. So it's good for average people like Americans who need to retire to put their money in it so it goes up in value, and by the time they're no longer able to work can help make sure that they're able to survive. It's not a perfect system, right? Ideally, elderly people should just be able to survive without playing this weird stock market game, but it's a system that we have in the United States, and it's the one that retirees were relying on. So, given all of that, it is relatively safe-ish under normal circumstances for people to have their retirement accounts like this, according to all historical data that people had seen. But this guy, Jim Cramer, now comes in and is like, no, we're not living in times like anything you've ever seen. This is bad, and you should be panicking more. And I think that you need to sell everything you got low at a loss. He's like, look, who cares if you bought it for $5, now it's worth $2. What if it goes lower than $2 and you lose even more money? Cut your losses and sell now. And this is how you start to have average Americans, and especially a lot of elderly retirees, lose a ton of money fast. Very often when people are like, we lost everything during the Great Recession, what they're talking about is either their retirement portfolios like this or their houses. And this was bad advice that this guy gave, okay? Like on October 6, 2008, when this guy gave the advice, a share of Apple stock was worth $3.28. In 5 years' time, when Cramer was saying like, hey, if you need any money in the next 5 years, you need to sell it, that stock would be worth $17.38. So if people had held it rather than selling, they would have definitely made money over the next 5 years. But everyone was scared. So people did start to sell all of the stock they owned at a loss, tanking their retirements. So basically, there was just panic and chaos going on everywhere in the financial world, and private media companies made money exploiting that chaos by fear-mongering, which is another effect of capitalism doubling down to completely screw over the average American person. On October 14th, the U.S. government announced that it would inject $250 billion of public money into the U.S. banking system, taking on equity positions in banks that chose to participate. The next month, the U.S. government announced plans to bail out another company deemed too big to fail, Citigroup. So the government purchased $45 billion worth of Citigroup stock shares, again blurring the lines between that free market for major corporations in the U.S. and providing something people sometimes call corporate welfare to big companies. By December, automobile companies like General Motors and Chrysler received a total of $80.7 billion with a B of public money in the form of bailout funds to keep afloat. And 8 days later, the Federal Reserve reduced short-term interest rates to 0% for the first time in American history to boost loans for real estate sales and capital investment. They were really trying to convince people to just spend money. But the average American person continued to struggle while all this was happening, and resentment was growing towards both the government and these major corporations who were getting all of the help and handouts and bailouts that average Americans needed. So, as 2008 came to a close, the federal unemployment rate was up to 7.2%. Small and medium-sized companies around the U.S. were collapsing, and 1 out of every 14 Americans was unemployed. I myself ended up going down to partial unemployment at my job, and I had to file for unemployment insurance as a result of this. The phone lines were always so busy, you couldn't speak to anyone. You just had to fill out a piece of paper and send it via regular mail because their online services were not the greatest. They were not super consistent. And hope one day you'd open your mailbox and a check would be there from the government. It was so wild. And some people just never got checks at all. There were clerical errors and you could never seem to reach anybody to resolve them. It was terrifying for a lot of people. And in New York, the number of people in homeless shelters jumped 40% in 2008 compared to 2007. So we truly did see real-time negative effects of all of these things happening to average people around us. By 2009, I was graduating college, and the recession was really solidified just as a part of our daily lives. We all by this point knew what was going on. Small companies would fail, big ones got bailed out, stock prices and house prices plummeted. Rich people with extra cash lying around started to buy stock and houses at dirt cheap low rates to hold as investments to sell in the future when the economy recovered. And the poor, meanwhile, just became unemployed and homeless and lost whatever assets they had previously managed to accumulate. As Americans struggled to maintain some semblance of a normal life, the U.S. government continued to bail out major corporations all around us. In January of 2009, Bank of America received $20 billion in federal funds and $100 billion in guarantees in subprime mortgages. In April, automotive giant Chrysler filed bankruptcy with $39.3 billion of assets. In June, automotive giant General Motors filed bankruptcy too, with $91 billion of assets. The company was kept afloat in a new capacity due to government bailout loans, so it left its bad assets with the old General Motors so that it could progress with a cleaner and healthier financial outlook as the new General Motors. The Treasury Department to this day still owns a 32% stake in the new General Motors that emerged from this. By the time 2009 came to a close, the U.S. unemployment rate was up to 10% for the first time in a quarter of a century. 1 in 10 Americans was out of work. Home foreclosures went up to 2.9 million per year, and a total of 7.5 million since the recession began in 2008. And if you're wondering who bought those 7.5 million homes like my dad's that got foreclosed on, well, it was mostly investment firms, which, as you can probably guess, did not end up being great for the average American reader, which we'll see. By 2010, the Great Recession is starting to kind of cool down and balance out. There were still 9 million fewer jobs in the market than had existed before the recession. And unemployment for young people in my age range, 16 to 24, hit 19%, which meant that roughly 1 in 5 young people were struggling to find work. However, the economy did start to slowly rebound and things started to get a little more normal. But all of those young people, the 19% who were unemployed and the people even who were employed from that young age group, they were part of the people who got hit the hardest by the long-term effects of the Great Recession, which everybody in the United States is still contending with today. For people in my age range in particular, a major thing that happened for us during all of this is that our careers were never able to properly take off, which means our jobs just kind of sputtered. Millennials were graduating college at the time of the recession, and it's when we would have gotten into the job market to get all of our entry-level work experience under our belt. However, there were fewer companies even around to apply to, and because so many companies were closing, recent college graduates found themselves competing with desperate workers who had lost their jobs, who had years of experience. For someone like me, fresh out of college, I would apply for an entry-level position in my degree field alongside someone who had a decade of work experience, and both of us were applying to work a job for minimum wage. They were applying to the same job as me because they were desperate and there just frankly weren't enough jobs around. And of course, the companies hired the person who had the most experience because they were getting a huge discount on that experience. And people like me were left to fend for ourselves. And that's why so many millennials weren't able to get jobs in their field of study and instead ended up in service industry jobs or weird side hustle attempts at survival that didn't pay well and took advantage of us. Also, another weird side effect of this, I think, is girl boss culture. Girl boss culture is obviously atrocious, right? It's hyper-capitalistic and individualistic. However, it was born out of the realization that we were all left to fend for ourselves. We had to learn to swim or we'd sink. And a lot of millennials fell victim to this girl boss hustle culture mentality as a result, biting the capitalist hook, line, and sinker line that said, if you just hustle harder, you'll be okay. You don't have to think about anybody but yourself. And girl boss culture really became a trauma response to the recession in a lot of ways, which doesn't justify it, but does explain why so many millennials doubled down on the capitalist entrepreneur-based thinking. And everyone else around who didn't fall into this hustle culture thing, well, they just found really shitty jobs to keep them alive. We're talking low-paid jobs that don't meet anybody's qualifications, with awful benefits, no paid time off, no sick leave, no health insurance. And this, coupled with the disastrous effects of Reaganomics put in place when we were born, resulting in extremely low wages and high costs for things, really cemented the financial tragedy of millennials and later Gen Z. Millennials became the first generation who by their 30s failed to earn as much money as people born a decade before. One 2017 analysis of Federal Reserve data showed that 25 to 34-year-olds in the year 2013 were earning 20% less than the same age group in 1989. In total, the median household income has declined for people born in the 1980s compared to people born in the 1970s. Where nearly every child born in 1940, for example, earned more income than their parents did, only around half of children born in the 80s, like me, did. And that percentage is shrinking over time. Millennials in particular suffered the greatest blow to employment stability during the recession, and it followed millennials for the next decade to come. And out of all of this desperation came the gig economy, which we've done a full episode on before, if you're interested in learning more. It's episode number 30, Playing the Gig. But basically, as a summary, people struggling to find proper work after the recession were forced to make do with non-traditional employment in the form of freelancing, which intersected with a tech boom to be largely funneled through new apps that were developed. And these jobs ended up skirting legal boundaries, meaning that freelance gig workers were no longer eligible for things like benefits or collective bargaining in a lot of places. Today, 1 in 6 Americans has a non-traditional employment arrangement, and most of it centers around these gig-based apps. For lots of people, their non-traditional employment violates labor laws, and many gig workers are misclassified as independent contractors when they should in fact be employees with heightened protections and legal rights. Misclassification has become a huge issue in the world of gig work, and gig companies spend hundreds of millions of dollars to fight back against legislation aimed to protect these workers by properly classifying them as actual employees. By classifying gig workers as freelance workers rather than employees, companies like Uber can avoid paying certain taxes, benefits, overtime, and even minimum wages, while also denying drivers the ability to form labor unions or negotiate. Today, 44% of millennials and 50% of Gen Z participate in non-traditional employment of some kind, much of which is within the gig economy that grew from the ashes of the Great Recession. And this is a huge problem because the gig economy is directly contributing to the increased labor exploitation of these two generations. Around 1 in 7 gig workers earn less than federal minimum wage on an hourly basis, and 29% earn less than their state minimum wage. That means that nearly a third of gig workers are making less than minimum wage for their labor. While 38% of Americans who work full-time outside of the gig economy said they would have a hard time coming up with $400 from an emergency in the year 2019, which is still way too high and really, really shocking and stressful, like nobody is getting paid well, this number was even more shocking for gig workers, for whom the figure is more like 58%. That's 20 percentage points higher. 1 in 5 gig workers also went hungry in the year of one study because they literally could not afford food to eat. And nearly a third of gig workers participate in public food subsidy programs, which means that our public tax dollars feed them, which isn't a problem, right? Like food should be a human right as well, until you look at how much money the CEOs of these gig apps are keeping for themselves. Like we, the public, are subsidizing the cost of employing their workers so that the CEOs of these companies can make more and more money. In short, we're paying their employees so they don't have to. It's textbook stolen wages capitalism issues. Gig workers make hardly anything. Other poor and low income and middle class people support them through their tax payments. And the rich on top at all of these companies that employ everyone just pocket the extra cash that should have gone to adequately paying their workers. It's stolen wages. In 2021, while gig workers struggled to have enough money to eat, the CEO of Uber earned nearly $20 million in annual pay. That's in 1 year, which was an increase of 63% over the year before. That same year, the CEO of Lyft earned nearly $14 million in annual pay. In 2020, the CEO of DoorDash was the second highest paid executive in the world, with compensation valued at $414 million for the year. So these people are all getting money from the companies that claim there's not enough money to pay their workers more. And in addition to lingering issues finding stable and steady employment, millennials have also struggled to retain control over debt since the Great Recession. Roughly 2/3 of students who graduated in 2008 graduated with student loan debt, with an average initial balance of $23,200, compared to just 58% of students with loan debt in 1996, when it averaged around $13,000. Studies have found that the Great Recession significantly increased total student debt, as well as the inability to repay student loans, either due to prolonged issues facing the labor market and the relative attractiveness of pursuing graduate degrees or other higher education in the face of the uncertain future. And I saw this so hard. Like around me, lots of people chose to pursue additional degrees or even a college degree during the height and aftermath of the Great Recession, just because they couldn't find stable work and they knew student loans would afford them the ability to comfortably live. During the Great Recession, the number of students enrolled in college jumped nearly 16% as a result of this kind of thinking. And meanwhile, federal policy encouraged Americans to attend school, all while funding for education decreased. So in 2007 and 2008, federal legislation raised the amount that students could borrow, causing student loan debt to increase from $110 billion in total in 2007 to $132 billion in total in 2010. And this was so significant that it marked the first time ever that student loan debt surpassed credit card debt in the United States. But graduation rates for students who enrolled in college in 2008, 2009, and 2010, they were all pretty low. In all, graduating during a recession can slow down your financial trajectory by 10 to 15 additional years. And today, millennials owe an average of $38,877 in student loan debt, and many cite their student loan debt as being a primary deterrent for them owning a home. And remember how we talked about homes and we talked about all those foreclosed upon homes being bought up by investors? Well, yeah, a lot of them ended up getting sold in bulk at auctions. And this has led to this landscape where today, major corporations own an estimated $60 billion in single-family homes. In one Atlanta zip code, some of the world's largest private equity groups and hedge fund investors acquired nearly 90% of all single-family homes sold between January 2011 and June 2012, following the peak of Great Recession foreclosures. In California, the number of owner-occupied homes dropped 320,000 from 2006 to 2012. Meanwhile, the number of single-family homes occupied by renters, meaning owned by landlords, went up by more than 720,000. Major real estate corporations like Blackstone started buying single-family homes in bulk, adding them to their existing portfolios of apartment buildings. And this has been huge for millennials who would want to be buying and purchasing their own homes. Now they're forced to contend with corporate landlordship. Just 64% of millennials are set to experience home ownership from the ages of 45 to 54, compared to 72% for baby boomers when they were in the same age range period. So for someone like me, when I look at all of this about the Great Recession, and I look at a lot of the struggles I've had to find my footing in adulthood, most of them are rooted in my failure to launch immediately after college, graduating into the recession, yes. And I got it a lot better than some of my peers. Most of my peers that I knew personally graduated with more like $100,000 in student loan debt. Mine was around $30,000. And then they would leave college to go look for jobs only to find none. Then they would end up moving back in with their families and ultimately defaulting on their student loans, forever hindering their ability to become financially stable. And all of this, absolutely all of this, stems from America's obsession with capitalism and categorizing homes as an asset class that appreciates in value. Because of this, homes in the United States are increasingly owned by corporations who raise the rent on a whim and make it even harder every single year for the average American to just get by. Today in the United States, the median monthly rent is $1,870, while the median monthly income is just $2,915 before taxes, leaving just $1,045 available every month for the median person renting and earning an income to cover your entire life outside of your housing, your taxes, but also your food, your transportation, your bills, you name it. And these are not normal increases in rent that we've been seeing lately. Rents are increasing in value and price extremely rapidly. Typically, rent growth would be around 3 to 4% per year on par with inflation. But from 2021 to 2022, it was 17%. And the short answer for why this is happening is because corporations know they can. Meanwhile, American home ownership rates, the literal American dream, plummet. As of December 2022, the U.S. home ownership rate was just 65.9%, ranked 34th in the world amongst other even capitalist nations. By contrast, Cuba and Vietnam both have a 90% home ownership rate, and in China, 70% of millennials own a home. Even within the urban city centers where real estate tends to be priciest, 96% of people own their own homes. And China is now, yes, one of the countries with the highest rates of home ownership in the world. The lingering truth of the Great Recession is one that few people don't want to say outright, but it's this. Capitalism isn't here to protect us. It doesn't care about our human rights. It doesn't care if we freeze to death or have to sleep in our cars. Capitalism only cares about the profit incentive to the owning class. And that's why capitalism can't create affordable housing. It can only turn human rights into commodities to be exploited. So that's it. That is my super uplifting episode on the Great Recession. I hope I did all right without Kenna here. Kenna will also be out of town on vacation for the next 2 weeks, so I will figure out what type of content we're going to be cooking up going forward for that. In the meantime, like I mentioned, you can find us on Patreon. We do have some bonus episodes there for just $2 a month, and we will be resuming as normal when Kenna returns from her vacation. In the meantime, I know I'm going to miss her very, very much, and I'm sure a lot of you will miss her as well. But thank you so much for being here and listening and supporting. I can't tell you how much it means to both of us, and especially to me. I love doing the podcast. I love being able to share information with you all. It's just a really, really special thing that I'm super grateful for. So that was too sentimental and mushy. And I think that's probably a good sign for me to end the podcast episode today. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks so much for listening to another episode of Pick Me Up, I'm Scared. If you would like to join us on Patreon, you can find us at patreon.com/pickmeupimscared. And like always, all of our sources will be in the show description if you just scroll down a bit. Our Patreon is currently starting at $2 per month, but if that's too much money for you, we totally get it, and we're just happy you're here.